Everything we've been doing in these activities it's explored the layout and routing of blood through the systemic circulation, but they've all followed the same kind of plan. Arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, back to the heart. It's all the same kind of plan. There are some instances where that plan doesn't hold up, where there are slight variations in that plan. And I want to go over those, or two of those candidates right now. There were a couple questions about these forms of circulation at the end of the test, so you might have a bit of experience. But we're looking at hepatic portal circulation and pulmonary circulation. And the hepatic portal circulation really answers this question: how are nutrients absorbed? This is the circulation that transmits any nutrients in the food you eat to your body. This is the circulation that brings them on board. And it is shown here. The hepatic portal circulation is shown here. And you can see from the schematic, just looking at it in general, it drains all of the visceral organs, the splanchnic organs, the spleen, the stomach, the intestines. So we have a few organs that you may or may not recognize that I'll just point out here. The liver is fairly obvious. It's large. It sits in the upper right-hand quadrant of the abdomen. The stomach, which has a familiar kind of horseshoe shape. The spleen sitting up to the left. This is the large intestine, this corrugated tube, or at least part of it. The ascending and descending large intestine. There is a piece over here that connects those two that's been cut away. And the small intestine is missing. So we've removed that for clarity's sake. So you're not seeing the small intestine to allow you to see the hepatic portal circulation. Now, it's so named for the hepatic portal vein, indicated here. All of this venous drainage ends up in the hepatic portal vein. All the blood coming from the intestines, from the stomach, from the spleen, from the pancreas, ends up in the hepatic portal vein, and that delivers blood to the liver tissue proper. So take a look at this vein as it enters the liver. It doesn't actually connect to the vena cava right away, which is this vertical column behind the liver. It divides and splits and delivers blood to the tissue of the liver for it to have a chance to be processed. The liver has first crack at glucose coming in, fats coming in, alcohol coming in. Anything that you put in your body first goes through the liver. Now it's called portal circulation because it doesn't follow the typical progression. It doesn't, it's circulation that doesn't connect arteries to veins. This connects two capillary beds. They are capillary beds at the stomach or the intestines, and the capillary beds at the liver. So these are veins that specifically connect two capillary beds. Are they supposed to? What's happening? Is that like a tour? They're learning something. So it connects two capillary beds. The two main branches of the hepatic portal circulation are first and foremost the splenic vein, or the splenic vein. This was a question on the quiz, by the way. The splenic vein primarily drains the spleen, the pancreas, and the stomach. Spleen, pancreas, and the stomach, with a few tributaries coming from the large intestine, the large descending intestine over on the left-hand side. Right as you look at the screen, but left in the anatomical position. And so the splenic vein will collect blood. There's one large obvious vein that runs along the pancreas to the spleen, and it's conveniently called the pancreatic vein. That's one of the major inputs to the splenic vein. The other is the inferior mesenteric vein, and you've seen that word come up a fair bit. There are mesenteric arteries and mesenteric veins. The inferior mesenteric veins, or vein, is what is responsible for collecting all of these branches at the colon, at the descending intestine, and at the rectum. And it doesn't really, there aren't clear divisions. It looks like a web of veins, and it is. But they're named for their general area. So the left colic vein is what drains the left colon. Or the superior rectal veins drain the superior portion of the rectum. All of those feed into the inferior mesenteric, and that feeds into the splenic vein, which returns everything to the portal circulation. That's one half. Second half is shown here in the middle. A rather large vein, the superior mesenteric vein, which is responsible for draining largely all of the small intestines. And we'll learn the small intestines are where nutrient absorption occurs, where all that fun stuff that you eat gets taken up. And so the superior mesenteric vein is really what is responsible for draining those nutrients and delivering them to the liver. But it doesn't only drain the small intestines. Again, you see this meshwork, this lattice work of veins that spreads throughout the viscera, and they're named for the regions or the organs that they would drain. So you might call the portion in the middle here, in the book they call them jejunal or ileal veins, and that's simply a name inferring that they drain the jejunum, which is part of the small intestine, or the ileum, which you can actually see the ends of over here. This is the end of the ileum, the end of the small intestine. And if you look down here in this region, this is where the ileum meets the colon, hence ileocolic veins. And the right colic veins draining the right portion of the colon, the right large intestine. So named for the organs that they drain, or their areas, their regions within the abdominal cavity. And this is as complete or as extensive as our discussion will be on that circulation specifically, until we get to the digestive system. You can imagine all of the food moving through the digestive system will have nutrients absorbed and passed into these veins, which collect at the portal vein and are delivered to the liver tissue proper. What's missing from this picture is how the blood gets back to the normal circulation. And it does that. It leaves the liver tissue all the way at the top through what are just called hepatic veins. Not hepatic portal veins. They're simply hepatic veins. Veins that drain the liver. Hepatic is the word describing the liver. And now we're in familiar territory. These enter right into the inferior vena cava, and we know where that drains, right atrium. Now we're back in the familiar systemic circulation. So I like seeing it put together in this way. It's a bit more descriptive, but there is a flow chart if it helps as well. The book shows you exactly what we've just discussed. The major portions of the viscera that drain or deliver nutrients to the two main branches of the hepatic portal vein. It's delivered to the liver and then through hepatic veins returns to the systemic circulation. This is exactly the same thing that we just talked about, but it brings in the arterial supply, which was one of the questions on yesterday's activity. The proper hepatic artery that delivers oxygenated blood so the liver tissue can work properly. So any high-level questions on this? Is there anything that is not making sense on our journey from A to B? Do you take any detours? No? Good. That leaves us enough time to talk about the pulmonary circulation. How is blood oxygenated in the pulmonary circulation? Did you catch in the activity yesterday as well? One of the questions was asking where the bronchial arteries arise from. The bronchial arteries, which would supply the bronchioles and tissue of the lungs. They come off of the aorta. It's not part of the pulmonary circulation. So, these diagrams in your book, I think, are quite poor. And they don't really add much to our current understanding of the pulmonary circulation. We know a lot of this already. I think most of us do. We know the heart, we know the pulmonary trunk, we know the lungs, or at least the heart as it sits in orientation or in relation to the lungs. You can see the diaphragm here on the inferior border, supporting, or not supporting, but on the inferior border. I'll leave it at that. The pulmonary circulation starts with the pulmonary trunk, right? That leaves the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood moving through the left and right pulmonary arteries. And then, until now, we've left it as a question mark. But this doesn't really help us understand capillary exchange at the lungs any better. Somehow, blood is then oxygenated in these loops. There's loops in the lungs, which is really not the proper orientation. I'll show you a better depiction of that in a second. But somehow blood is oxygenated in all of these little looping strands. Maybe. If you accept that for now, somehow it's oxygenated in these loops. It ends up collecting in the pulmonary veins and returning to the heart. But a more appropriate description that I'll show you in a coming slide is instead of these loops where all of a sudden the blood changes from blue to red, deoxygenated to oxygenated, think of it as there's constant divisions, smaller and smaller arteries that envelop what are called the alveoli. They are the sacs, the small terminal spheres where air reaches tissue in the lungs from the outside and the environment all the way into all the branches of the airways in our lungs. The end point are what's called the alveoli, small little balls or little sacs that are surrounded by these capillary beds. And I'll show you what that looks like coming up. Right, and then after the capillary beds, we collect in the pulmonary veins, and we're back to familiar territory, on to the systemic circulation. Poor figure. Again, a flow chart to help reinforce this information, which it gives us less detail, as a matter of fact. There's nothing new here. I really like looking at something like this, personally. This really shows the level of detail that helps get the idea across. So, what are we looking at? These are the individual spheres, the alveoli. that clump together in alveolar sacs. And this is the end point for all air that you breathe in. With every single breath, air gets down to this point. Goes no further, gets into the alveolar sacs and the alveoli specifically. So there's air from this room in your alveoli right now. But if the air's there, it's not doing anything. It needs to interface with blood being pumped by the heart. And it's these capillary networks that allow that to happen. So let's put this in context. We have incoming pulmonary arteries shown here in blue. Remember, those are deoxygenated. All of the blue is pulmonary artery, deoxygenated blood. You can see the divisions. You can get down to as fine a level of detail as you'd like. Divisions here, divisions here. This meshwork, even the blue meshwork around the alveoli, is somewhere between a pulmonary artery and a capillary. And notice, any one alveolus, any one sphere, is completely encapsulated, completely surrounded by that capillary bed. Completely surrounded. So the distribution of blood, it's around the entire alveolus. Lots of surface area for the exchange of gas. And now it follows the same principle we saw in that 3D video. Capillary exchange by diffusion. CO2 out, O2 in. The capillary beds start to merge. We see anastomoses that bring the venous branches now back together. Venous being oxygenated in the lungs. And eventually, returning blood to the pulmonary veins and back to the left atrium. This, I feel, is much more descriptive and easy to understand than those loops in the lungs that your book will show you. You doing okay? Should we call someone? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Those are our two special cases. Hepatic portal and pulmonary circulations. Let's recap. Introduction revisited. I think we did most of these. What we didn't do in specific detail is trace the circuits of blood. We didn't pick an organ and then from the heart move through all the branches on the arterial side to get to that organ and then follow the flow of venous blood back to the heart. We didn't do that specifically, but I did try to ask you a number of questions covering a variety of these organs and the activities. So I think that you have an understanding of the major arteries and veins. But it might be a good idea in your own personal studying to try that. Pick an organ and trace blood through the systemic circulation. Incidentally, the heart is one of those organs. It's part of the systemic circulation. It might have helped you guys with question 1. In summary, in this section, we saw that blood generally flows in parallel throughout the body to all of the organs or organ systems in the body. Not all of the blood in the body has to go to the spleen, or not all of the blood in the body has to go to the intestines or the muscles in the leg. That's what I mean by in parallel. Blood sent at the same time to the muscles and other tissues. It doesn't have to wait and line up. We saw that all arterial blood has the same composition. It all mixes in the heart. Equal oxygenation, equal glucose, nutrients, hormones. anything else that's in your bloodstream. Arterial blood has the same composition. Venous blood does not. It depends how much of some item the tissue is taking up, how much the tissue is adding. Venous blood varies. I do think that you have a good understanding of at least the general divisions and some of the names of the major vessels in the body. Some major circulatory routes, including where the locations, the connections. We only glossed over some of the circuits in the brain. We really glossed over a lot of the visceral blood vessels as well. But you know the major players. You know the celiac trunk and the 3 divisions off the celiac trunk. That kind of thing. To add to this, today we just explored the hepatic portal circulation, and it should be fairly obvious how nutrients from the food that you eat are absorbed here first before being distributed to the body. The liver gets first crack. And then we also just saw the pulmonary circulation in a lot of good detail, how the pulmonary veins divide, and the capillary beds encapsulate the alveoli. You'll learn a lot more about the structure of the lungs in lab coming up next week. We do pulmonary anatomy and physiology. Just anatomy, good. So you'll learn about alveoli, bronchi, bronchioles, all the airways, and the lung tissue itself.